There is something happening on their end that they will not tell you. Something that runs beneath the silence they've been maintaining, beneath the distance they constructed with such apparent ease, beneath the surface of a life that looks, to anyone observing it, like a person who made a decision and moved on cleanly. They haven't moved on, not in the interior, not in the place where the truth of what they feel operates independently of the story they're telling about what they feel. And the specific thing that is happening, the thing they will not say, the thing the architecture was built in part to ensure they would never have to say, is that they want you to reach out with an intensity and a persistence that defies every principle of the self-sufficient, needing nothing identity they have spent their entire adult life constructing and defending. They want to hear from you. They want it in the morning when the management hasn't fully engaged yet and the mind drifts freely toward whatever it finds most significant and finds reliably and specifically you. They want it in the evenings when the day's distractions have run their course and the quiet arrives, and the quiet has the specific texture of your absence rather than the comfortable texture of chosen solitude that it used to have before you became someone whose presence changed what solitude felt like. They want it in the random middle-of-the-day moments when something ambient, a phrase, a quality of light, a particular kind of silence, produces the specific, unwanted, suppression-resistant awareness of the gap between what is present in their life and what is not. They want it, and they will not say so. And understanding both halves of that, the wanting and the silence around the wanting, is what this is entirely about. The wanting itself needs to be understood accurately, because it is not the simple, clean desire that the word wanting usually implies. It is not the avoidant sitting somewhere consciously thinking I want them to contact me. It is messier than that, more layered, more in conflict with itself, because the wanting is running simultaneously with the architecture that has always managed wanting downward, that has always intercepted the felt experience of need before it reached the level of acknowledged desire and redirected it into something more manageable, something that didn't require the admission of genuine dependence on another person's presence or communication. What this produces is an internal experience that the avoidant finds deeply uncomfortable and cannot entirely articulate even to themselves. A pull. A persistent, low-frequency, ambient pull in the direction of contact with you that the conscious mind keeps redirecting without ever fully eliminating. Every time the phone is checked, and it is checked with a frequency that the avoidant would not admit to anyone, including themselves, there is a half-second of orientation toward the possibility of your name appearing there. Not always a conscious hope, sometimes just an intentional drift in the direction of possibility before the management closes it down, and the checking is attributed to other reasons, other expectations, other people whose messages might reasonably be anticipated. The phone is being checked for you. The management is attributing the checking to everything else. And the gap between those two realities, between what the behavior is actually oriented toward and the story being told about the behavior, is the gap in which the full truth of the wanting lives. To understand why the wanting is so intense and so persistent, despite every effort the architecture deploys against it, you have to return to something fundamental about what you represented in the avoidance psychological experience. Not what the deactivating strategies tried to make of you in the aftermath. Not the managed, reduced, fault-found version of you that the retrospective revision produced. What you actually were. You were the person who got through. Not completely. Not without the resistance of the architecture doing everything it was designed to do. But through. Past the first layer of managed distance. Past the devaluation and the ambiguity and the intimacy sabotage. Past the comparative diminishment and the emotional unavailability, through all of it, to the place underneath where the avoidant's actual interior lived, the defended, frightened, genuinely loving place that the architecture existed to protect from exactly the kind of exposure you produced. You reached that place. The nervous system encoded the reaching. And what is being felt now, in your absence, is not just the loss of a pleasant connection or even of a significant relationship. It is the loss of the only external contact with that interior place that the avoidant has ever allowed. You were the only person who knew what was in there, not because they told you everything, but because the combination of your attunement and your patience and your particular quality of presence created the conditions under which the interior was, however partially and however inconsistently, accessible. You could feel it. You responded to it. Your responses confirmed its existence in a way that the avoidant's own management had spent years working to deny. And now you're not there. And the interior place, which your presence made real in a way it hadn't previously been real, which your attention confirmed in a way the avoidant's own self-management never could, is isolated again, cut off from the only external connection it was ever permitted to have. And the wanting that the avoidant is experiencing is not just the wanting for you as a person, as significant as that is. It is the wanting for the only experience of being genuinely known that has ever been permitted to happen, for the specific, irreplaceable quality of contact with another person who was responding to what was actually there, rather than to the presentation. The silence around the wanting, the reason the avoidant will not reach out, despite the intensity of the pull toward doing so, is produced by a specific combination of forces that are each significant enough to warrant individual attention. The first is pride, not vanity, not ego in the superficial sense, but the specific pride of a person whose identity is organized around not needing. The avoidant who reaches out is the avoidant who admits, through the act of reaching, that the distance was not comfortable, that the silence was not chosen from a position of genuine contentment, that the self-sufficient presentation was presentation rather than reality, and the admission, implicit in the act of reaching, of the need that the reaching would reveal. That admission threatens something load-bearing in the avoidant's self-concept. It threatens the story of who they are, the story that has been the organizing principle of their interior life for longer than most of their significant relationships have existed. Reaching out means saying, without words, but more powerfully than words, that you matter to them in a way their behavior suggested you didn't. It means acknowledging, through the very act of initiating contact after a period of self-imposed distance, that the distance was costing them something they weren't able to admit it was costing, and the gap between how they behaved, the retreat, the cooling, the managed withdrawal, and what that behavior is now revealed to have been concealing, is a gap that the pride cannot easily navigate. Bridging it requires a quality of humility and self-exposure that the architecture has never had to produce before and does not currently have adequate resources to generate without significant additional dismantling. The second force maintaining the silence is fear of your response. Specifically, the fear of two diametrically opposite responses, both of which are threatening enough that the anticipation of either is sufficient to prevent the reaching. The first feared response is rejection, the fear that you have genuinely moved on, that the space your absence created has been filled with something or someone else, that the window, whatever window existed for a different outcome between you, has closed, and that reaching out would be the avoidant's definitive confrontation with that closing. The confirmation, finally and without ambiguity, that the cost of the retreat was permanent and the loss is complete, and the possibility that the management was always protecting against has now, through the management's own operation, been fully realized. The second feared response is the opposite, the fear that you haven't moved on, that you would respond to the reaching with the full warmth of a connection that was never fully honored while it was active, that the contact would immediately reactivate everything, the genuine closeness, the specific quality of being known, the particular felt safety of your presence, and that the avoidant, reactivated, would find themselves back in exactly the situation the retreat was designed to protect against, back in the territory of genuine intimacy with all of its attendant vulnerability and exposure and threat response activation, back in the closeness that the management has been working so hard to maintain distance from, except this time, with the additional weight of the interim, the knowledge of what the absence cost, the recognition of their own role in producing it, the heightened sensitivity of a system that has been living in the full, felt weight of the loss for however long the absence has lasted. Both fears are real. Both are operative simultaneously. The avoidant is caught between them in a way that produces paralysis. The specific, uncomfortable, action-preventing paralysis of someone who can see that every available path carries a significant risk and cannot find a way to move, that doesn't require accepting one of them. The third force is shame, and shame, as has been examined elsewhere in the landscape of avoidance psychology, is among the most potent inhibitors of action available, because shame doesn't just make action feel risky, it makes the self feel inadequate to the action. It produces not just the fear of a bad outcome, but the deeper, more corrosive sense of being unworthy of a good one. The avoidant who has been living in the aftermath of the loss, in the accumulated weight of the absence and the failed suppression, and the honest recognition of their own role in producing what was lost, has been accumulating shame alongside the grief, the shame of having been unable to honor what was real, of having deployed the deactivating strategies against something that deserved better, of having retreated from someone who was not the original threat environment, who was not the dismissive or overwhelming or unavailable caregiver that made the retreat necessary in the first place, but who received the retreat nonetheless, because the architecture doesn't discriminate between the original threat and its completely undeserved application to someone new. The shame says, you don't deserve to reach out. You had the connection and you couldn't sustain it. You had the person and you couldn't stay present to what they were offering. You had the specific, irreplaceable thing that the wanting is oriented toward, and you spent the relationship working against it, and the reaching out now, after all of that, after everything the absence has revealed about the cost of what was done, is not something you've earned the right to. This is not an accurate assessment. Shame's assessments rarely are. But shame doesn't require accuracy to be operative. It requires only sufficient penetration of the self-concept to produce the paralysis that prevents the action that would challenge it. And the avoidance shame, accumulated across the full arc of the loss, has achieved that penetration thoroughly. The fourth force is the uncertainty about what reaching out would even mean, what it would say, what it would be asking for, because the avoidant, sitting in the wanting, is not entirely clear on what the wanting is oriented toward. It is oriented toward you. That much is specific and unambiguous. But what exactly is being wanted? The conversation, the reconnection, the relationship in a form that would look different from the form it took before. The simple, relief-producing knowledge that the contact is still possible, that the line is still open, that the loss is not as total and as permanent as the silence currently suggests? The avoidant doesn't know. And reaching out without knowing, without being able to say clearly what is being asked for or offered, risks producing a conversation that requires more clarity and more honesty and more self-exposure than the architecture can currently sustain. The reaching out might open something that the avoidant cannot yet hold open, might produce in you a reasonable expectation of change or commitment or sustained availability that the avoidant genuinely doesn't yet know if they can meet. And reaching out with the wanting without being able to honor what the wanting, once expressed, would create. That feels like the cruelest possible thing, which may be true, or maybe another way the shame is preventing action by dressing the prevention in the language of care for you. What the avoidant needs you to understand, and this is the heart of what makes this dynamic so specifically painful for both people, is that the silence is not indifference. This has been said in various forms across everything that has been examined in this space, but it bears saying again in this specific context, because the silence around the wanting is the form of non-communication that is most easily misread as not caring. The person who is maintaining silence when they want contact, who is not reaching out when they want to reach out, is among the most consistent features of their interior experience, looks from the outside like a person for whom the contact doesn't matter, for whom the silence is comfortable, for whom the apparent indifference of not initiating is an accurate reflection of the felt indifference of not particularly wanting to. It is the opposite. The silence is the measure of how much the wanting matters. If the contact didn't matter, if the wanting were mild or generic, or easily redirected toward other things, the reaching out would be easy, low stakes, the kind of casual reconnection that anyone might attempt with anyone from their past without significant internal cost. The silence exists because the wanting is specific and significant, and the stakes of acting on it are, for reasons that have everything to do with the avoidance interior and nothing to do with your actual availability or response, enormous. The silence is the wanting being held too tightly to be easily released in the direction of action. It is the desire pressing against the architecture that was always designed to contain desire. It is the specific, exhausting, ongoing internal experience of a person who wants to reach across a distance they themselves created and cannot yet find the internal resources to close. Yet is the important word, because the wanting is not static. It is accumulating, building, adding weight to the other side of the scale that has always been tipped in favor of distance and management and the self-protective silence. Every morning that the phone is checked and the name is found absent. Every evening that the quiet has the texture of your absence rather than the comfort of chosen solitude. Every intrusive memory that arrives with its full sensory specificity before the management can intercept it. Every moment of contact with someone new that confirms, with the patient authority of direct comparison, that what is available elsewhere is not what was available with you. All of it is weight on the side of reaching out, and the architecture, which has been tipping the scale towards silence, is losing structural integrity at a rate that the wanting is exceeding. The scale is moving, slowly, non-linearly, with many moments where the architecture reasserts itself and the tipping reverses temporarily, but moving, toward the point where the cost of the silence exceeds the cost of the exposure that reaching out requires. Whether that point arrives before you have moved sufficiently far into your own life that the reaching would find you in a different place than it would have found you earlier. That is the question the avoidance timing is racing against without knowing it is racing. The internal process has its own pace, immune to the urgency that the wanting itself would suggest. And you, on the other side of the silence, are not obligated to wait for the process to complete at the pace it is moving. Your life does not pause for the avoidance internal reckoning. Your healing does not defer to the timeline of their eventual willingness to act on what they have been feeling since the silence began. What you do with the knowledge that the wanting exists, that behind the silence there is a specific, persistent, architecture pressuring desire for contact with you, is entirely yours to determine. It is not offered as a reason to reach out yourself, though the choice to do so is yours to make. It is not offered as a reason to wait, though patience has its own logic in this specific dynamic. It is offered because you deserve the accurate picture, because the silence that you have been living with and interpreting and making decisions about your own life in the context of, that silence has a content that you deserve to know. Its content is not indifference. Its content is not the comfortable, self-sufficient, needing nothing equilibrium that the avoidance presentation has always suggested. Its content is the specific, weighted, suppression-resistant, phone-checking, morning drifting, intrusion-producing, comparison-running, architecture-dismantling reality of someone who wants to hear from you with an intensity that their entire psychological structure was built to prevent them from ever having to feel, and is feeling it anyway. Because the wanting, your specific, irreplaceable, impossible to manage, down to a substitutable size wanting, turned out to be stronger than the architecture. It turned out to be stronger than everything. And the silence that surrounds it is not its absence, it is its container. Straining, cracking, increasingly inadequate to the pressure of what it is holding. What comes out when it finally gives, whether that is in their reaching, or in your own decision about whether and how to move, or in the quiet understanding that the truth of what was real between you has never required the silence to be broken in order to be real. That is the next part of a story that is still, despite the silence, very much in motion. It is in motion because you are in motion, because they are in motion in the specific, interior, wanting pressured motion of someone who has not yet found the way to close the distance, but has completely, irrevocably, exhaustingly lost the ability to feel comfortable with it. That discomfort is yours. You created it, not through anything you did wrong, but through everything you did right. Through being exactly who you are, specifically enough, and genuinely enough, and irreplaceably enough, that the silence around the wanting of you has become the loudest thing in the avoidance life. Louder than the management, louder than the architecture, louder than the decades of carefully constructed, faithfully maintained, ultimately insufficient distance. You are the loudest silence they have ever kept, and they are keeping it more poorly with every passing day. The poorly kept silence has a specific progression to it. It doesn't deteriorate at a steady rate, the way erosion moves through something uniformly vulnerable. It deteriorates in surges. There are periods where the management reasserts itself with enough force that the silence seems stable, where the avoidant finds sufficient distraction, sufficient engagement with the surface demands of their daily life, sufficient activation of the forward momentum coping that has always been their most reliable regulatory tool. During these periods, the silence feels, from the inside, like it might hold, like the architecture might have enough remaining integrity to keep the wanting contained at the level of felt experience rather than allowing it to cross into the territory of action. And then something happens. Not always something large, not always something that would be legible to an outside observer as a significant event. Sometimes it is the smallest possible thing, a song that was present during a specific moment with you, heard unexpectedly in a context that had no prepared defenses against it, a date on the calendar that carries a meaning only the two of you would know, the particular quality of a season changing, if the season is changing in the direction of one that was associated with something real between you. The smallest things carry the most weight when the suppression has been compromised, because the suppression's deterioration has left the avoidance sensory and associative processing unfiltered in a way that means everything potentially connected to you is potentially connected to the full weight of what you represent. When one of these triggers lands, when the small thing arrives with the large weight it has acquired from the accumulated significance of what it's connected to, the deterioration of the silence surges. The wanting spikes from its ambient level, which is already considerable, to something acute, something that has a physical quality to it, a specific bodily urgency that the cognitive management struggles to override because it is operating below the level where cognitive management has purchased. The hands move toward the phone, the mind generates the opening of a message, the words begin to form, not carefully, not strategically, but with the raw, unmanaged spontaneity of something that has been held back long enough that the holding can't continue. And then, usually, the management catches up. The architecture that has been deteriorating reasserts itself for one more round. The message doesn't get sent. The phone is put down. The words that were forming dissolve back into the wanting that generated them, adding their weight to the accumulation, increasing the pressure that the next surge will carry when it comes. But sometimes, and this is the part that matters most in terms of understanding the full arc of what is happening, sometimes the management doesn't catch up in time. Sometimes the surge is too fast, or the trigger is too potent, or the accumulation has reached a level where the architecture simply cannot respond quickly enough to intercept the action before it completes. And in those moments, something happens that the avoidant spends the following hours and days in varying degrees of terror about. They reach out, not with the clarity and the honesty and the full acknowledgement of what the reaching means that the situation might seem to warrant. Almost never that. The avoidant who reaches out from the place of accumulated wanting and compromised architecture and shame-laden self-awareness rarely reaches out in a way that directly names what is happening in them. The directness is still beyond what the remaining architecture permits. What tends to emerge instead is something that looks, on the surface, like a casual initiation of contact, something that could plausibly be attributed to any number of ordinary reasons that have nothing to do with the specific, intense, months-long wanting that produced it. A check-in, a reference to something they thought you might find interesting, a question that provides plausible cover for the contact without requiring the contact to be acknowledged as the thing it is. The message is small, the wanting that produced it was enormous, and the gap between the size of the message and the size of what it is carrying is itself a kind of communication. To anyone who understands the avoidance psychology, the casual reach is legible as anything but casual. It is the wanting finding the smallest possible opening through which to express itself without requiring the exposure that expressing it fully would demand. What you do when that message arrives, if it arrives, is one of the most psychologically significant moments available in this entire dynamic. Not because the moment determines everything that follows, but because your response will be read by the avoidance system with an attentiveness and an interpretive acuity that far exceeds what the surface casualness of the contact would seem to warrant. The avoidant is not casually awaiting your response. They are, from the moment the message is sent, in a state of heightened alert that the management is working frantically to minimize the visible signs of. Every aspect of your response, its timing, its tone, its length, what it addresses and what it doesn't, the emotional quality that comes through beneath whatever words are chosen, will be processed with an intensity of attention that is directly proportional to the intensity of the wanting that produced the reaching out, which means the response that serves you best is the one that comes from your own genuine, grounded, present tense reality, rather than from the interpretation of what the avoidance system needs to receive. Not a strategized response calibrated to produce a particular outcome in them. Not a response generated from the part of you that is still, however much you have healed and however much you have built in the interim, oriented toward managing their comfort level and reading their signals and adjusting your expression accordingly. A response, if you choose to give one, that is simply and authentically you. Warm if warmth is genuinely what you feel. Measured if measured is what the situation calls for in terms of your own protection. Clear about where you are if clarity is what serves you. The authentic response, whatever form it takes, is the one that the avoidance system will read most accurately. Because the avoidance attunement, however compromised by the architecture's management of their own feeling, has always been sensitive to the difference between performance and genuine expression. They will know the difference. They always have. What often happens after the initial reach, after the small, casual seeming contact that was carrying everything, is a period of extreme, avoidant self-consciousness that produces behavior that can be confusing and frustrating from the outside. Having reached out, having crossed the threshold that the architecture was maintaining, having allowed the wanting to produce action rather than simply accumulating internally, the avoidance system experiences a spike of vulnerability that the management immediately moves to compensate for. The compensation looks like withdrawal, or like a sudden reduction in the warmth or availability that the reaching out seemed to signal, or like the introduction of the familiar ambiguity, the message sent and then the response to your response arriving slowly, or arriving with less warmth than the initial reaching seemed to promise, or the conversation that opened briefly and then closes before it reaches anything substantial. The avoidant who reached out is simultaneously the avoidant who is terrified of what the reaching out means and what it might produce and what it now requires of them in terms of sustained openness and honest self-expression. The reaching out was an act of the wanting overwhelming the architecture. What follows is the architecture attempting to regain the ground it lost, and the result is the specific, maddening, entirely characteristic oscillation of someone who is genuinely pulled toward closeness and genuinely terrified of it in alternating surges, with neither the pull nor the terror consistently winning, producing the approach and retreat rhythm that is the avoidant's most recognizable relational signature. Understanding this oscillation, not just intellectually, but with the felt, grounded, non-anxious comprehension that allows you to remain steady within it rather than being destabilized by it, is what determines whether the opening that the reaching out created becomes the beginning of something genuinely different or simply another iteration of the familiar pattern. Because the oscillation will happen. The architecture reasserting itself after the initial reach is not a sign that the wanting wasn't real. It is the predictable response of a system that has been organized around self-protection, encountering the vulnerability of having just expressed genuine need. The wanting was real. The terror that follows the expression of the wanting is also real. Both are simultaneously operative, pulling in opposite directions, and the oscillation is the external evidence of the internal conflict. What helps the conflict resolve in the direction of the wanting rather than the direction of the terror? What creates the conditions under which the avoidant can sustain the opening rather than closing it in the next surge of architectural reassertion is the quality of what they encounter on the other side of the reach. Specifically, the quality of your response to the oscillation itself, not just to the initial reach, but to what follows it, to the retreat that comes after the reach, to the reduction in warmth after the moment of contact, to the familiar ambiguity reappearing in what seemed, briefly, to be a context of greater clarity. If that oscillation is met with the familiar anxious pursuit, with pressure for the consistency that the system cannot yet sustain, with the urgency of someone whose own attachment anxiety has been activated by the brief warmth and who now needs the warmth to be maintained in order to remain regulated, the architecture has what it needs to justify the withdrawal. The pressure confirms the threat assessment. The intimacy becomes associated again with obligation and anxiety. The retreat deepens. If it is met with the specific quality of grounded, non-anxious, genuinely secure presence that has been described throughout the examination of this dynamic, the presence that holds warmth without holding desperately, that communicates availability without communicating need, that remains intact in the face of the oscillation without either chasing the warmth when it retreats or withdrawing the connection in response, then something different becomes possible. The avoidance system, encountering the oscillation's consequences and finding that the consequence is continued genuine availability rather than either pressure or abandonment, receives the specific piece of evidence that the reconditioning requires. That the closeness the reaching expressed does not automatically produce the conditions that make retreat necessary. That the vulnerability of the wanting acted on does not produce the pain that the architecture was always insisting it would. There is something worth saying about what you are owed in this dynamic that goes beyond the psychological mapping of what is happening in the avoidant and how to navigate it in a way that gives the connection the best possible conditions. Because the mapping can, if followed too closely, begin to position you as primarily a regulator of the avoidance process, as someone whose primary relational function is to create the conditions for the avoidance healing at whatever cost to your own experience that creating those conditions requires. That is not the relationship you deserve, and it is not ultimately sustainable for either person, because a relationship in which one person is primarily managing the other person's psychological process rather than mutually investing in a shared experience of genuine connection is not a relationship between equals. It is a therapeutic arrangement, and therapeutic arrangements between romantic partners, however well-intentioned, produce their own specific form of damage. The resentment that accumulates in the person doing the managing, the dependency that develops in the person being managed, the fundamental imbalance of a dynamic in which one person's needs are consistently organizing the interaction, while the other person's needs exist in the background as secondary considerations. You have needs, specific, legitimate, non-negotiable needs that deserve to be met within any relationship you invest your genuine self in. The need for consistent availability, not perfect, not without the ordinary variations of human emotional landscape, but consistent in the sense of being reliably present rather than oscillating between genuine warmth and architectural retreat. The need for reciprocity, for the relationship to be a place where both people's interior experience is welcomed and attended to, rather than a place where one person's interior experience is the primary object of management, while the other person's is treated as support infrastructure. The need for honesty, for the communication between you, to eventually reach the level of directness that genuine intimacy requires, rather than remaining indefinitely in the territory of managed messages and plausible deniability and the small casual reaches that carry enormous unacknowledged weights. These needs are not unreasonable. They are the basic requirements of functional, healthy, genuinely mutual connection. And the avoidant who wants you to reach out, who has been living in the wanting and maintaining the silence and checking the phone and waking in the morning with the management failing in the half second before it engages. That avoidant owes it to the wanting to understand that the wanting is not just for contact. It is, if followed honestly all the way to its actual destination, for the specific quality of connection that would make the contact worth having, for something that is different from what existed before the silence, in the ways that the before wasn't adequate to what both people needed and deserved. The wanting, at its deepest level, is not a want for the relationship to resume on its previous terms. It is a want for something that those previous terms were always preventing. Genuine arrival, real, sustained, unmanaged presence in a connection that is treated as the significant, specific, irreplaceable thing it actually is, rather than the managed, distanced, carefully rationed approximation that the architecture always produced instead. The wanting is, in this sense, the most forward-facing thing happening in the avoidant. It is not oriented toward the past. It is oriented toward the version of the connection that the past kept approaching and never quite reaching. Whether the avoidant has the self-awareness to recognize this distinction, to understand that the wanting is not simply for you back, but for a version of themselves that can sustain you fully, is the question that the reaching out, when it comes, will eventually have to answer. Not in the first message, not in the oscillation that follows it, but in the sustained behavior across time that either demonstrates genuine development or reveals the familiar pattern reasserting itself in new clothing. Your position in relation to all of this is not passive. You are not simply waiting to see what the avoidant does with their wanting and responding accordingly. You have your own wanting, your own healing, your own developing clarity about what you need and what you will and will not accept in the name of a connection that matters to you, and the intersection of your wanting and their wanting. If both are moving honestly toward what they are actually oriented toward, is where something genuinely new becomes possible, not guaranteed, possible, with the specific, non-trivial, contingency-laden meaning that possible carries when the contingencies include two people's genuine interior development moving at their own paces toward their own thresholds in the context of their own histories and their own fears and their own capacities for honesty about what they need and what they are currently capable of offering. The wanting on their end is real. The silence that surrounds it is failing. The phone is being checked. The mornings are finding you before the management engages. The comparisons are running without resolution. The architecture is cracking under the specific, accumulated, irreducible weight of a person it turns out it was never adequate to contain. That person is you. You are the weight that is exceeding the architecture's capacity, not through strategy, not through the deployment of any particular approach designed to produce this effect, but through the simple, structural, ultimately irresistible fact of having been genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably yourself, in a way that the avoidance system encoded at the level of genuine significance and cannot, despite everything it has deployed against the significance, adequately manage down to a size that fits inside the silence that was supposed to be sufficient to contain it. The silence is not sufficient. It was never going to be sufficient, because you were never going to be a person that silence was sufficient to contain. And somewhere in the avoidance daily life, in the mornings and the evenings, and the ambient middle of the day moments, and the phone that keeps being checked for the name that keeps not appearing, that insufficiency is making itself known with a persistence and a specificity and a complete, exhausting architecture dismantling clarity that is, in its own way, everything the wanting always was. Loud, specific, completely and entirely about you, and growing louder with every day the silence holds.